really see very specifically. So you could really see very specifically how the medication is helping them. Then we have things that are called the randomized controlled trials. And these are just research studies in which the patient is assigned to one of the two different intervention groups. And the idea behind this is so you reduce any bias you might not even realize you have as you are doing a trial. When you look at a randomized controlled trial, or RCTs, that's a short name for what a lot of the medical studies are called. And in these, the subjects are randomized, just like in a regular randomized clinical trial, but one of the groups is a control group, either receiving a placebo or a regular conventional therapy. So what you are testing is the new intervention, medicine, therapy, whatever, against an established product, therapy, medication, or an actual placebo. So studies then that are placebo-controlled trials is a specific randomized control trial where the comparison group is a placebo or something that is not to have any impact on what it is you are measuring. So in a trial like for a medicine, let's just say Epidiolex, when they do the trials, there is one group actually getting that medicine and one group that is getting just a placebo or the solution with no medicine in it. And that way you can have a direct comparison. And finally, the last kind of set of words is the studies that are double-blinded. And if there is a double-blinded trial, it means that neither the participant, you all, your child, nor the researchers know if you are getting the intervention, the experimental medicine, or if you're getting the placebo. So again, completely removes a bias because I don't know what you're getting, you don't know what you're getting, although oftentimes family can kind of guess if they're actually getting the medicine when they're in these trials. So when we look at trials that medicines have to complete in order to get FDA approved for standard medicines, they are usually double-blind, placebo-controlled, randomized trials. And oftentimes, again, we'll just abbreviate those to RCTs. Sorry about that. So I don't know if any of you guys have ever heard of the clinical trial phases. You might hear something as this was a phase 3 trial or a phase 2 trial or something along those lines. And just to go over those so you understand what the lettering means. So a phase 0 trial is one where the medicine is being given in human subjects, typically for the very first time. So this is a very, very small number of patients at a very low dose, and they're simply looking at safety. After that, assuming everything's okay, they go on to a slightly bigger trial. So still a small number, and still in healthy subjects, people who have not the medical concern that the medicine is being looked at to treat, but now they're having some escalating doses or some higher doses. So they're looking at more safety over more patients, as well as what the optimal dose would be. Then you can look at phase 2 trials. So again, another just step up. Now you have a slightly larger group, although in general, still a pretty small number. But this time, the people who are doing the trial are the ones with the illness or disease that the medicine or treatment is trying to help. So now you're not only going to be getting some information on safety, but you're going to be getting a little bit of information on efficacy as well, or does the medicine work? Phase 3 is in the next step. Again, a larger number of patients who have the illness or disease that is being treated. It is looking at efficacy and safety, and the phase 3 trials, now efficacy is usually the primary endpoint, and efficacy simply meaning does the medicine work? These are your double-blind, placebo-controlled randomized trials, or RCTs. Then phase 4 is the phase where the medicine is FDA approved, but you still want to learn more about the medicine. You want to learn more about the long-term safety. More, does it remain helpful for seizures or whatever you're trying to treat? Does it have any other good benefits or any concerning side effects? Looking over a vast number of patients. So that's what phase 4 trials are. Now, when we look at trials specifically in Dravet syndrome, some of those numbers that are on the screen are slightly smaller just because Dravet syndrome is a rare disease and the numbers are smaller as opposed to a medication for hypertension that is affecting, very many people. So it is oftentimes for like the phase 3 trials that were done in Epidiolex and fenfluramine, those we're having more in the 120s in terms of subjects for a particular trial as opposed to the thousands. So the numbers are, a little bit of estimates overall, but you can kind of see how the phases of the study builds and builds really looking at safety first. So looking at seizure trial medications across the board, so we're not talking just Dravet syndrome, but historically, how are these studies done? And very simply, if you have a medication that you want to get FDA approved and you're doing in one of those randomized controlled trials, you are first going to have a baseline period. And that is something so that you can compare the individual subject, can compare how they were doing on the medicine that's being looked at versus how they were doing off the medicine. So that off the medicine time is your baseline time. All your other seizure medicines stay the same. You try to keep everything else the same, and you just count seizures. That is every individual's baseline. Usually, baselines for trials last about 4 to 6 weeks. Then you have the titration phase, just like you do for every medicine out in the real world when you start a medicine. You have the time where the medicine is begun and then slowly increased. And that is typically about 2 weeks, but that can certainly vary amongst medicines. During this time, you're still counting seizures. Now you're also going to be looking for side effects, but that's where the intervention is begun. Then you have the maintenance phase. How long are you going to be looking to see how well that medicine works? This really depends on the medicine. You can have a maintenance phase in anywhere from 1 month to 6 months. Usually for seizure medicines are about 3 months. That's what it was for Epidiolex and the Fintepla. It was 2 months in the stiripentol trials back in the 2000s, so there can be some variability there. The medicine itself, we'd like it to be completely stable. All the background seizure medicines completely stable. And again, you're still looking at adverse side effects. Just to be aware, when you look at results of studies, they oftentimes will look at the baseline versus the treatment phase. And the treatment phase is a combination of the titration and the maintenance periods. And that's just something that the FDA requires. It's a little bit strange because I look to see if a medicine is effective, really kind of more in the maintenance phase. I think you are likely to still continue to have seizures when the medicine's at a low dose and just building up. That's why in a lot of studies, you'll see 2 sets of data. How well the seizures responded, both in the treatment phase for the FDA, as well as the maintenance phase, just for more practical use. Then, as you can guess, you have a whole lot of things that are gathered during these different parts of the phases. And the baseline period, it's, again, your baseline labs, exams, weights, everything, again, that you are going to compare later on for when the patient is on the medication itself. And during the maintenance phase, you have all sorts of follow-up clinic visits where you're going to be looking at seizure counts and adverse side effects and safety labs and any other testing for anything you want to see if there's a change. Might not be just seizures, as we will see, but also for all of the safety data. Now, a few things that are specific for seizure trials. One is just how they classify seizures. So when somebody comes into a clinical trial, you want to count seizures. So you want to count similar types of seizures in groups. So a couple things I just would like families to note during a trial. and I think anybody who's done the trials with me kind of knows this, we spend a lot of time sitting down, deciding what we are going to classify every particular seizure as. And in Dravet syndrome, it can be difficult because you can have so many different types of seizures with one patient, with one of your kids. In addition, the seizures in Dravet syndrome are often a little bit difficult to classify using the International League Against Epilepsy classification system that was really based on adult seizures. So sometimes the seizures that a child with Dravet syndrome will do won't fit exactly into a hemiclonic versus generalized versus focal with observable motor signs. So it can be a little bit difficult to know how to classify a seizure. So we sit down, we do our best, full clinical description, decide what we're going to call the seizure. And then the most important thing for the trial is that you continue to call it that, again, through the baseline and the maintenance period. So it's all just done the same way. But I do think it's one of the hardest things for parents who are filling out the seizure diary, because sometimes I would have families who would be filling out like 6 different seizure types. You know, is it a hemiclonic seizure? Is it a hemiclonic seizure that then secondarily generalized? Or is it a generalized clonic-tonic seizure from the start? And then you have to classify it differently if it's just the hemiclonic versus the hemiclonic that becomes a secondarily generalized seizure. So it's kind of just a lot of information there, and sometimes the seizure classification can be a little bit difficult. Now, one of the things that families often will ask me is, well, you know, what did this medication, what seizure type did it really help? And it's interesting because it also goes back to the question of what is the seizure type that's simply being studied. And in Dravet syndrome, you want to study a seizure type that is significant for the patients that you're studying, but also ones that are definitely countable. Nothing that's, oh, I'm not quite sure if that's a seizure or not. So in Dravet syndrome, the seizure types that were counted in all of these major studies were called convulsive seizures, whether that be a hemiclonic seizure or bilateral tonic-clonic seizure or more of just a stiffening spell, but anything that had a really big motor component to it. Just for a comparison, kids who have Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, a completely different seizure type, have very distinct drop seizures, whether they be a stiffening and a drop down or a generalized tonic-clonic for which they drop, but they have drop seizures. So that is typically the seizure type that's counted in Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, even when the same medicine is being studied. So for example, the Epidiolex trials, the convulsive seizures were counted for Dravet syndrome, but in Lennox-Gastaut it was the drop seizures. So again, as we discussed, that one of the things that you need are seizures that can be counted. So they need to be very distinct events. And sometimes you do have seizures that are so frequent, like myoclonic seizures or absence seizures, that you really can't count them. I mean, for patients who have a lot of these seizures, it's not like you can stare at your child for 24/7 and count every single seizure they have. In one study that did not involve Dravet syndrome, there was a big, huge study that looked at absence seizures. And because those can be so difficult to quantify and count, people actually were using EEGs to help confirm absence seizures and determine counts for them. Finally, in order to count the seizures, you then have to record it somehow and get it back to the pharmaceutical company. So you use seizure diaries. These can be papers that you write on, phone devices, phones, calls, little handheld devices, all sorts of different ways you can do it. And it certainly is a pretty significant caregiver effort, I think. I know I have a lot of families who, even not in a study, count all of their child seizures, but I certainly have many who don't. So sometimes counting it, you know, for a trial really is quite a bit of time for the families. So in terms of how could we improve some of the seizure evaluations for these studies, one, there's always a question of an EEG. Would an EEG be valuable or not? It might be a little bit of, it might be valuable for just kind of some background information, but at this point in time, it's not like you're going to be wearing an EEG for 3 months to help count your seizures. So I don't think it's going to be overall valuable for seizure counts or necessarily even determining how to classify a seizure, because some kids' seizures might be once a week, and again, a little hard to keep an EEG on for an entire week. Certainly, it'd be great if we had a device to count seizures. That would be great in your overall daily lives. But at this point, we just simply don't have that. We are getting closer. As many of you know, there's, the different smartwatches or Embrace Watch, but they are still counting mostly convulsive seizures, and there's certainly multiple different seizure types. But someday I could see in the future where there is a device that actually can read an alarm for temperature, or, there is one already for heart rate, the pulse guard, but many things in a small device that's easy to wear that might be able to count seizures. And that would certainly improve a seizure trial. And finally, there, I think, needs to be some attempt to try to quantify non-countable seizures. Again, even though you can't count every little myoclonic seizure, I think families could definitely say if they improved a lot, a little, or resolved. And even that would get us some information for these different medication trials for if they really help myoclonic or absence seizures. Next, I just wanted to mention about, okay, the study's over. How do people relay the results of if the study was a success or not? Again, efficacy just means, did the medication work? And again, it is a comparison in the randomized control trial of how the patients did who got the research medication versus how the patients did who got the placebo. And most studies relate the results by something called the responder rate. So if you ever heard of somebody saying, oh, this medicine had this much of a responder rate, what they mean, what responder rate really stands for, is a 50% responder rate, meaning how many of the patients had a greater than a 50% reduction in their seizures. So simple example, Epidiolex responder rate was 43%, and in the placebo group it was 27%. So you can say, yes, Epidiolex definitely worked better than placebo. Just FYI, that placebo number is pretty high. Placebo numbers in pediatric epilepsy trials are usually about 10 to 15%. I think people were just really excited to be trying that Epidiolex initially. As a comparison, the fenfluramine without stiripentol trial, the 50% responder rate was 68% versus a 12% for placebo. Another way that you can look at efficacy is what percent of the convulsive seizures were reduced. So looking at the same thing, just a slightly different way. So amongst all the patients in a group, be it treatment or placebo, what was the overall reduction in seizures or in convulsive seizures is what was looked at in the Dravet Syndrome trials. So for example, again, this was Epidiolex's primary endpoint, and Epidiolex had a 39% reduction of seizures versus 13% placebo. A lot are also looking now at what was the seizure-free interval, an average seizure-free interval for if they had the medicine, for if they had placebo. Because I think that means so much to families. Like if a child goes from having a seizure every 3 days to a seizure having every 20 days, that's really a huge benefit. We're also going to look at some adverse side effects that are just obtained in every regular basic trial. These are some safety measures. Things like vital signs and weights and heights. And that's really important, I think, for the Dravet community, because a lot of these kids tend to be on the kind of smaller side. So if they have a decreased appetite and then decreased weight, that can be a big deal. Basic evaluations also include just physical exams, different laboratory tests, looking at liver, blood counts, kidneys. There's definitely some variation here. Some look very specifically at other things like thyroid function test or testosterone. Others don't do that. Most studies will also look at the blood levels of the other medications, and that makes perfect sense because you want to see if there's any interaction between the experimental medicine, and your standard seizure medicines. And there can also be what we call the pharmacokinetic blood draws, or multiple blood draws over time once that experimental medicine's given, so you can see how quickly it comes out of the body. That helps dosing in the future. Other tests, EKGs are pretty standard, just looking at some simple heart rhythms. And then it depends on the medicine if there's any other concerns that they want to monitor. So obviously for fenfluramine or Fintepla, they did the echocardiograms to look at the structure of the heart. And then when you come in, every time you come in for a research evaluation, you would be asked, any difference from the last time seen? Child more sleepy, has some diarrhea, not eating as well, any of those things, as well as were there any hospitalizations or any more serious side effects. So all looking at safety measures of whatever medicine is being evaluated. But now we're going to switch course a little bit and look at how we can evaluate other things outside of seizures. Seizures are evaluated because that is the main outcome that the pharmaceutical companies are looking for. These are anti-seizure medications that they are trying to get FDA approved. So those are always the primary outcomes. But they obviously want to know if the medicine has other outcomes that may be beneficial. So it's something that the companies have been looking at for quite a while. I think Epidiolex really took that a step further. And it was because in the real world, people that had been getting cannabidiol had reported better behavior, attention, focus, sleep, all sorts of other things. So they wanted to see if they can tease any of that out in the trials. And then certainly this has been taken a little bit to the next level with some of the genetic studies with Stoke and Encoded doing the ASO or antisense oligonucleotide trials, because again, they're trying to correct the SCN1A mutation deficit. And if they do that, the hope would be certainly not just treating seizures, but treating everything that Dravet syndrome affects. So these are things that have become more and more important in clinical trials as of late. And we'll take a look quickly at what people are looking at. In terms of, I don't have to tell this group, you know, Dravet syndrome affects so much more for the child than just seizures. And I think parents are some of the best people to say, these are the things outside of seizures that we are concerned about, that they have food fad, that their behavior is concerning, they have difficulty with transitioning, all of those things you guys know better than anyone. So some of the recent studies that have looked at this, looking at parent input or parent surveys, are these two studies that were both in epilepsy and behavior. One of which was straight from the DSF with Nicole and Marianne and Sue Goodliff, that was looking at the outcomes of some surveys that were done through the DSF. And the other one was through Ann Berg here at Lurie Children's, who was looking at different very specific patient cohorts and looking at some families' advice of what they're concerned about, what worries them, and trying to evaluate it in a more scientific way. But as we stated, Dravet syndrome affects many other things. We're going to be looking at mostly the area of development and cognition, behavior, gait, and sleep as to other things that can really be evaluated during a trial. The first, because it's probably the easiest to stratify a little bit, is sleep. I think sleep concerns are so hard for kids with epilepsy because you have that cycle of, if you have bad sleep, you can trigger seizures. Nighttime seizures can trigger bad sleep, and you just get into a really bad cycle of it. When you looked at some of the survey studies, we know that children with Dravet syndrome can have insomnia or difficulty initiating sleep, as well as difficulty maintaining sleep, and are often up in the middle of the night or wake up very early. So certainly how some of the studies have evaluated these in the past, the most simple way is that single question, a sleep disruption survey that basically says on a scale from 0 to 10, how's your sleep? One question, very quick. Now, to get a little bit deeper into the information, you can keep sleep diaries. this does become a little bit more cumbersome because remember, you're already keeping seizure diaries. And now you're going to list all the times a child falls asleep at night, wakes up in the morning or in the middle of the night or during the day. So it's a little bit of a cumbersome thing, but you're going to get much better information about it. But of course, you do have to look at the accuracy a little bit because you cannot be watching your child 24/7. You need some sleep as well. So of course, I think you have a very good sense of how much your child is sleeping and how you're doing. But again, sleep diaries is another level of better information, but more work to get there. Finally, you can look at devices to monitor sleep. The old way to do this was something called an actinograph, and in our modern age, you can certainly get some information off an Embrace watch or even something as simple as a Fitbit. I don't know how many of you out there have a Fitbit and it just monitors your sleep, how well you're sleeping, etc. So there's certainly, I think, if we can electronically get some better ways to measure sleep, that would take off some of the burden from the families from having to keep a sleep diary. My talk is stuck. Okay. Next is looking at gait. Most of the studies to date for the randomized trial didn't look at gait. These are being looked at in some of the current natural history studies and some of the upcoming studies. So as you know, in Dravet Syndrome, when the kids are young, it's usually called an ataxic gait, when their gait's a little bit off balance. And certainly as the kids get older, kind of preteen to teen years, they might have a crouch gait where they're kind of slumped over a little bit. And that crouch gait can be a bit progressive over time. So again, how you can evaluate this, one is simply surveys. An example for this that's often frequently used, the Gillette functional assessment. And this looks at a set of questions based completely on walking, all the way from like, can you walk, to can you step over things, can you run, kind of a list of increasingly difficult questions. And then it also looks at activities and how your functional gross motor ability would be affecting those. But again, if we wanted to go a little bit beyond a survey, one of the things I know that's being looked at is a video analysis of gait, something where the families would literally take a video of their child walking, kind of front view and the side view. And you can literally measure angles from crouch gait to see how crouched over a child may be. Or you can just measure what the foot-to-foot distance is, how far they can walk, all sorts of things. If you wanted to take the next level at looking at gait and evaluating gait, the next that would be done is an actual true gait analysis. And this is done in rehab or ortho hospitals. And these are very, very involved tests and something I think might be a little bit difficult for some kids to be able to complete, at least complete participation in. So a concern with a gait evaluation in a randomized control trial would certainly mostly be the duration of the study. In terms of, again, most of these interventional randomized control trials are less than 6 months. With the maintenance phase, again, usually about 3 months. And during that time, you might not see a change in their gait. It might just simply take more time than that to be able to see that actual change. And that's where something like the natural history studies may really be helpful. Because if natural history studies can say, well, this is the outcome we expect well over time, then you might have a comparison for that child that a short study, an intervention study, might not be able to pick up on. Particularly hard, though, for, I think, a gait analysis in Dravet syndrome because it's just so variable. Some kids walking is quite good and others are quite significantly affected. So that variability means it's hard, even in a natural history study, to be able to tell what one individual is going to do. The next area of concern is the area of behavior. And there's, again, a significant amount of variability in behavior concerns in children with Dravet syndrome. and what those behavior concerns may be. Again, when we look at that survey study that specifically came out of the Dravet Syndrome Foundation, there's kind of two main categories of behavior concerns for kids. One with different autistic traits, as they call them, if it's perseveration or obsessions, difficulty with transitions, you guys can read that list. The other one being what they call psychiatric, some difficulty with impulse control or some kind of ADHD. It's not, I put it in quotations because I don't think it's a typical ADHD, but it definitely involves inattention and difficulty to focus, as well as then there's some irritability and aggression. So lots of different behavior concerns that may significantly affect the quality of life for the child. And the evaluations right now of behavior concerns in the studies are primarily surveys. And there's lots of different surveys that can be done. The most typical survey looking for autistic features is the MCAT. And that, as you can see, is a modified checklist for autism in toddlers. And then the brief survey, the Behavior Rating Inventory of Executive Function, is another basic survey list. Does your child have difficulties with this? And you rate it on a scale. So the other way to be able to evaluate these in a trial would obviously be to have a full evaluation by a medical professional, whether that be a psychiatrist, psychologist, or a developmental pediatrician. But again, that will add a whole nother level of complexity and time to all of these medications, to all of these trials. So as you can tell, the more information you kind of want to obtain about any of these comorbidities just means a lot more effort and time. So for development and cognitive ability, as you all are aware, initial development is normal in children with Dravet syndrome, and then they'll usually experience a slowing, sometimes a plateau of skills, or they just stop progressing at all. Sometimes a regression of skills, actually loss of something that they have learned, that most often will happen after a prolonged seizure. But those difficulties usually start to show themselves between 1 and 5 years of age. And subsequently, there is a spectrum of intellectual disability. I have a girl who's going off to college this year. I have some kids who are nonverbal over 5 years of age. So it is a spectrum. That is one of the things that, again, makes studies difficult, is when, especially when a child is young, we really don't know what their subsequent intellectual concerns will be. So it makes it hard if you have an intervention to determine if they have a good outcome. Was that because of the intervention, or was that just what they were naturally going to be? In any case, the evaluations for these cognitive abilities, again, usually result from surveys. As you can see, these surveys tend to now be very long. But the other option from surveys would be a formal neuropsychological evaluation. And some studies, especially some of the current natural history studies, are looking at these. These do give a more objective kind of study done by a professional evaluation. But I still always caution that the professional is going to be able to see your child for a couple hours at that visit. If they're really good, maybe a little bit longer than that. And what if your child had a seizure before the evaluation, or happened to really hate that transition that day and was not in the mood to have developmental testing? So the outcomes of these, even though they're objective and they tend to come with a number, might not be as good a reflection of your child's ability as a survey would be. So there's pluses and minuses of both sides. That's why most studies, if they're going to have this neuropsychological evaluation with a WASI or WISC or other testing, you'll also typically do the scales so they can see what the parent input is. Finally, there's some general overview scales that are often done. The most common, and everybody who's been in a trial as of late has done these, your global impression of change. I like this question. It kind of summarizes everything into one question. Bottom line is, before the study compared to now, is your child better, worse, or the same? And a little bit of a better scale than that. both the parent and the medical provider do these global impression of change surveys. And there's other ones, as you can see below that as well. A health-related quality of life questionnaire, which is also pretty to the point. And then if you really want to look at how a child is doing, it's longer questionnaires, and that's where the quality of life and childhood epilepsy questionnaires come in. I really love the ones that can be completed by patients because it really looks at their emotions. And it asks, how is your energy level? How is your emotions? How does epilepsy impact you? But certainly in some patients, especially in the group of Dravet syndrome, some patients won't be able to answer these. And then we'll usually have a parent fill out a quality of life survey. But it's another way, again, if you do these surveys as a baseline, you do an intervention, you do the survey again at the end of the intervention, let's say in 3 months, and there is a big difference that might help you say, okay, maybe this medicine is helping more than just seizures, which can be really helpful for families in the future. If you would be more likely to pick a medicine if it overall benefited the child's quality of life in a study. Quick, just mention, I'm just going to skip right over this slide, but every study nowadays, the FDA is required to have the study look at if the child has any increased suicidal ideation. Not a big effect for kids with Dravet syndrome, but I just wanted to mention that everybody who's done a study has probably noted those. And then for a study, if we're deciding how many of these comorbidities we're going to assess, and how deeply are we going to assess them? I think it's primarily a balance. You want a balance for the best information added that you can get, the most information, but not to put so much burden on the families during these trials. These trials already have increased research clinic visits and lab draws and tests and time. Families are going home and they're filling out all sorts of seizure diaries, etc. It's already a lot of time. So if you're adding more in-depth surveys or seeing other professionals like a neuropsychologist or a psychiatrist, again, it's just adding another level of complexity and time, a time commitment from the family. I'm not going to talk too much in natural history studies because I know Ann Berg has already talked here in one of these sessions, and she is a star of these. It's really wonderful way to get an idea of what a child would most likely do in terms of, seizures, cognition, behavior, all the things that we've talked about. There's always variability in all of these areas. So just because you say that, or I tell families that, most typically a child will have a moderate intellectual disability. Again, that can range anywhere from normal to nonverbal. So there's always a variability. The natural history studies kind of give an overall view of what is expected in each of these areas or what might be some concerns. But I also do always warn that natural history studies will always change over time. I know that a lot of the adult studies looking at Dravet syndrome, when they're giving outcomes for things like their cognitive ability, you have to remember that was before the time of stiripentol, often clobazam, Fintepla, Epidiolex. They're oftentimes we're getting medicines we know to avoid now. So it was just a completely different situation than it is now. So hopefully with the new studies that have come out, the new medications that are available and hopefully effective, we might see that there is a different natural history for Dravet syndrome than what there was 20 years ago. So in general, for designing better clinical trials, I think, honestly, I think the pharmaceutical companies working with patients with Dravet syndrome have come up with some of the clinical trials that have really been most beneficial. I think they've gotten more input than perhaps some of the other cohorts of patients that we see. But certainly I think for designing a study, one of the things that all pharmaceutical companies can do is really get a parent focus group, find out what your concerns are, what you would like to see from a medication, and then go from there. And same with some of these physician experts. If you're having a study that's looking at a gait analysis, I can tell you what I know about Dravet syndrome, but I can certainly not be able to tell you what might be the best way to assess that. You know, you need to go to a physiatrist or an orthopedic doctor for that. So you need physician experts in that area to help you design the best study. But I think that the studies that have been designed as of late in the last few years for Dravet syndrome have been very good. And that was the end of my talk. I hope it was somewhat helpful. I know it was kind of an overview and things that you all may have heard from some of your prior talks here. Thank you.
I was ready to say, Dr. Laux, I thought it was a great way to end our educational webinar series, just because we did hear from a lot of other companies about trials, but I don't think anyone along the last few months has kind of walked us through the steps of how it actually is to be in a trial. So I think you've probably answered a lot of questions if people are just kind of wondering what actually happens. So thank you for the information. I'm going to open it up now and see if anyone has any questions really quick. You can either take yourself off mute and ask those live, or you can put them in the chat box. Either way, I'll give you just a few minutes and see if anyone has any questions. John, it looks like you came up. Do you have a question for Dr. Laux?
I'm one of the rare parents that have all of my son's seizures in a database that I overanalyze every medication dose, every medication change. I apply machine learning against it to himself to figure out if we should be increasing, decreasing. It's been pretty invaluable for me tracking my own data on my child's responses. Looking at these clinical trials, my son's responded very poorly to Epidiolex, but like I feel like his data never even saw the light of day in that trial. What happened to him? I guess I'm just trying to think about having I don't know, like a significant seizure tracking application that's more of an analytical platform that is used across studies, not just here's some seizures on a piece of paper, it goes into a black hole. I don't know what I'm trying to get at, but I'm just trying to get at, like, if we all were sharing our data and you could actually truly see a full patient's medical history and how they respond to meds, better treatments could be figured out. So.
John, I completely agree with you. A couple things came to mind and triggered a couple things in my head. One, I don't think you're the rare parent that does that. I think I have a lot of families of kids with Dravet syndrome where every seizure the child ever has been marked. I have one child whose parents are both accountants, engineers, something where they're very computer savvy, who have the most beautiful program of documenting their seizures, any medication changes, any emergency medicines given. It's beautiful. So that's one. And I think you're also exactly right in terms of sharing data better would give us definitely more information on what medicines might be most helpful for kids. What a lot of these studies do not do, they tend to evaluate a medicine versus a sugar pill. So talk about the lowest common denominator of what they need to surpass in order to get FDA approved. But that is their goal, is to get FDA approved. That gives us almost no information on head-to-head studies between medicines. You can get some information if study designs are very similar. Epidiolex and Fintepla happen to have very similar study designs. So you can compare those a bit, but it doesn't give you a true head-to-head comparison. A lot of people have felt that, and I completely agree, that in the world of neurology and epilepsy, we've done a very, very poor job of all the physicians in the country kind of getting together to analyze what medicines work best for what seizure types and what patient. The comparison would be our pediatric oncology doctors, who every child who has a tumor comes in is on a specific treatment protocol, and that data is always there, so that they have databases of hundreds of thousands of kids. They know what medicine is best for this particular tumor and this particular pathology. We haven't done that, which is unfortunate. They're trying to do that more. There is now something called PERC, or Pediatric Epilepsy Research Consortium, that was put together just for this basis of, can't we all share kind of what we do in order to figure out what's the best medicine? Perhaps not with a few $1 million randomized control trial, but just real life data. If you start a medicine, does it work or not? And everybody using the same way to count seizures to try to be able to find that. It's one of my hopes that that will take off more in the future. It's relatively new, but your observations are exactly correct. I think we could definitely be doing a better job on collecting data and being able to tell what medicine is best. I hate having a family say, well, what are my options and which one is best for me? And I can't really say this one is best. I can say, this is what we know from the trials. These are the numbers. And that's really the best that we can do right now. But I think that you pointed to exactly a real world concern of what's going on with epilepsy.
Thanks. Just my last piece on that is, if we had the responses of medications with how your kid responds to a single med, mini meds, quantified, you could cluster them on who responds to alike meds for Dravet, if we had the data set.
Mm-hmm.
And the amount of time it takes to track everything, I mean, would be a huge effort from the Dravet community. It makes me want to figure that out.
Mm-hmm. It's something that Misty, we can bring up with the DSF, now has a, what's her actual title? Scientific advisor, research person.
Yes.
Because you do bring up a very good point. I think it's a big task, but I think that it would be something that would be hugely beneficial if it could be done.
Hey, John, if you want, I'm not sure if you want to email me some of your thoughts, I can pass it on to her. It's Misty, M-I-S-T-Y, at dravetfoundation.org.
Okay. I've talked with the scientific coordinator for DSF before.
You have? Okay.
I've sent her a lot of my work on all my kids' data. I'll send it to you anyway, and you can forward it on to Dr. Laux, and if anyone else cares to see it, all of his data is at seizuremonster.com. Okay,
and I believe we've actually, some of the staff have, I think we've seen some of your posts actually on the threads, the support groups. And I believe it was, did someone connect you with Dr. Perry?
I have a meeting with Dr. Perry September 7th.
Okay.
Give him a demo of the application. I've talked with some researchers in Canada. We have some other needs. They want to try to figure out what medications go to a genetic variant by allowing people to contribute data for that. I don't know. So we'll see what Dr. Perry thinks of what I've done so far, and I'll forward that on.
So the wheels are turning. We need parents like you. So this is awesome. So I'm glad that you're at least getting connected to some individuals that may be able to forward your thoughts.
Yeah, it's very hard to try to figure out what's important to me may not be important to someone else, and figuring out what the quality of life is. A lot of the measures that Dr. Laux was pointing out with like behavior and some things that you might track daily at, you know, a scale of 1 to 10. Well, I'm just happy that you might be trying to talk, let alone on a scale, you know what I mean? It's more of like, oh, he's trying to talk.
Yeah. Well, we all share the same goal. We all, I mean, I'm sure there's not a person on here that doesn't want the same end result. So I'm glad that you've been hooked up with Dr. Perry as well, and that you've also been speaking with Veronica. So, but still email me. I'll pass that information on as well to our executive director, even though I know we've already had talks about you. So we know who you are. Does anyone else have any comments or questions for Dr. Laux? Perfect. Well, there's nothing in the chat box, Dr. Laux, so it means that you gave a great webinar. No one has questions. I want to thank you all for joining me along these last few months that we've done these educational webinars. I've really enjoyed them. I've enjoyed seeing your faces and really just hearing from our different speakers. Dr. Laux, thank you for taking time out of your day today to just share your wealth of knowledge. And with that, I hope everyone has a great evening and happy Friday and have a great weekend.
It's Thursday.
I know, but tomorrow's Friday. Tomorrow.
Okay.
All right, you guys, have a great evening.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye, Misty, if you're still there.